All right, so today we are talking about Chapter 9, Section 2, which is looking at the American social class system. First thing we want to talk about is how we determine social class in our society. First method that we'll talk about is the reputational method. People rank others based on what they know of them. It's based on reputation. This is not the most accurate way of determining social class. And a lot of times, a lot of baggage can come with this. It can be connected to families and what you know of a family. I'm sure everyone who is in this class, you come from families where maybe you have heard them make statements, judging statements of other families or someone who, they are somehow, their older brother got in trouble, so your parents don't want you hanging out with them because the result of that is that they have a bad reputation. That family has a bad reputation. All right? The reputational method is not based on any kind of concrete fact. It is simply how you, your friends, a society views somebody and where they belong in society because of that. The second method of determining social class is what they call the subjective method. That is where people rank themselves. Now, quite obviously, there are going to be some major flaws with the subjective method. With the subjective method, people are going to be more likely than not to actually rank themselves as being middle class. The richer, more successful, more upper class people of American society typically do not rank themselves, unless they have extreme wealth, do not rank themselves among the elite of society. Instead, they are much more likely to call themselves middle class. At the same time, people who are poor typically recognize themselves as middle class as well. So what you see in American society, because we have over the generations beat into everybody's heads this concept that everyone is middle class, that America's strength is based on the middle class, there is a determination to consider yourself middle class, and quite honestly, there is an ignoring of what actually defines you as middle class. People just assume that they are average, and the result of that is that most people identify themselves as middle class. So that is a major flaw with the subjective method. The final method is what they call the objective method. With the objective method, sociologists are going to define social class in terms of income, job, and education. All right, so this is looking at much of the wealth, power, prestige concept that we looked at earlier, where we consider what level of pay you receive, what type of job you have. Is there a lot of prestige to the job, or is it something that people do not have a lot of respect for? And finally, what level of education you have. Are you a high school dropout? Do you have a high school diploma? Do you have your GED? Do you have an AA degree, a BA or BS? Do you have a master's, a PhD? What level of education you reach? All of those combined get put together by sociologists to figure out what social class you belong to. All right? Now, one thing I want you to do as you're watching this is to write out strengths and weaknesses of each of these three methods. We have talked about them. I want you to be able to identify them, and quickly also in your writing, tell me which method you think is most commonly used in American society as a means of determining what social class we belong to. Now, the social classes in the United States, as they're made up, and I've got it broken down into a lot of detail here. If anyone watching this is having a tough time reading the details we have, let me know and I can get you a printed off copy, no problem. So the social classes in the U.S., we're going to look first of all at the upper class. All right? This is the wealthiest 1 to 3% of our population. They control the vast, vast majority of all wealth, of all assets in American society. There are two groups within the upper class that you need to know. The first group is referred to as the upper class. The second group is the lower upper class. The upper class, the basic concept here, is that the upper class, these are the elites of society. They are the old wealth. They are old money. If you ever hear someone talk about someone having old money, that means family money. It's been passed down. This could be, these are also the families who maybe you don't even know where their fame comes from, but they have fame because of their access to money, their access to wealth. You look at the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts, if we're looking 100 plus years ago. You look at the Kennedys and the Bush families. In recent years here, even someone like the Hiltons maybe fall into this upper wealth category because they are coming from family wealth. These people, just because they're called upper class, it doesn't mean they are actually the richest people in society. They might be. But realistically speaking, there are people in the lower upper class who have more money than the people in the upper class, but they're not considered elite in the same way. There is a level of prestige, a level of class and respect that goes along with being in the upper class that people in the lower upper class do not have. The lower upper class, on the other hand, that is new wealth. That is people who are first generation wealthy. All right, it's the Bill Gates of the world, the Steve Jobs, the Oprah Winfreys, the people who have gone from families that were not upper class and made their way into the upper class. Now, like I said, Bill Gates, as an example, highly wealthy man, much more so than many people in the upper class. But he's not considered to have the same level of dignity, class, prestige, whatever you want to call it, as people who come out of the Kennedy family line. All right, next income class that we need to look at are your middle class groups. All right, the upper middle class. These are people who are high income business owners. Oftentimes they are professionals. They have college educations. Many times they have advanced degrees. This, beyond your BA or BS, getting into your master's or your doctorate. These people, as I mentioned, are going to work in highly successful businesses, own typically highly successful businesses. They have a lot of power because of that, a lot of prestige because of that ownership. And those who are not in the business category also oftentimes fall into the professional category. We're looking here oftentimes at doctors, lawyers, people who have extensive college education, extensive training, and thus work jobs that are highly compensated. Below them, you have the lower middle class. These are your white-collar workers. These are jobs that require less education and have less pay than the upper middle class. They live comfortably. They have traditional values, are typically more politically conservative, morally conservative. The lower middle class is going to include people such as myself. It's going to be someone who is a teacher. I do not have the same level of education, an advanced degree like you're going to find in the upper middle class. I don't have the same degree as a lawyer. My education has not been as extensive or lasted as long as that of a doctor or a lawyer. Because of that, I also have less pay than a doctor or a lawyer. People in my class, in this lower middle class, typically live pretty comfortably. They typically have very traditional values, as I mentioned. They are very family-oriented, I suppose. And they tend to, because of the traditional values, they tend to also be a little bit more conservative, as I mentioned, both politically and morally. Below them, you have the working class. These are your blue-collar workers. This is the largest part of our population. Sometimes the pay for the blue-collar workers might be higher or at least equal to the lower middle class, but the job simply isn't as prestigious. If you look on the prestigious ranking charts that we'll be looking at in class or that your book offers up, the reality is that there are plenty of jobs on there that are hands-on, kind of manual labor jobs that pay better than what my job pay. But they're not ranked as high on the prestige list because they're not seen as providing the same contribution to society or having the same educational demands. And because of that, they are less prestigious. People in the working class also less likely to have any kind of savings. These are the types of folks oftentimes maybe working in a factory type of setting and oftentimes have a tough time having the money put aside to retire at a decent age. Below them, finally, is the lower class. These are people who work low-paying jobs, part-time jobs, and are also included in the unemployed group. Now, a lot of these jobs are retail jobs. These are people who work low-paying jobs at places like McDonald's, Kohl's, Target, Shopko, places that pay, maybe can even provide in many cases 40 hours a week, but do not pay compensation that is going to be easy to support a family on. Oftentimes people in the lower class are put in a position where they're having to work multiple jobs in order to live at a relatively comfortable lifestyle. Many people who you see working retail at Walmart might also hold a job at McDonald's as a means of trying to make ends meet. Survival in this class is much more day-to-day. That means you are living like paycheck to paycheck, much more so. These people are concerned every time a paycheck comes around. Let's say on a Friday, paychecks come around. There are many people in this position who are stuck in a situation where they have to wait for that paycheck to come in order to get groceries for the week. All right, people in these positions are always going to be paid, compensated relatively lowly. And part of the problem with this is that typically people in the lower class have a lack of education. And because of that lack of education, future opportunities typically are pretty minimal as well. So what we end up seeing here is a situation where many of the people get stuck in this cycle and it becomes a family issue. All right, whatever social class, one of the things that you have to understand with social classes in the United States is that whatever social class you're born into, you are over 90% likely to be in that social class when you are an adult. And sadly, most of the movement amongst, going from social class to social class in American society is not upward mobility. It's not upward movement. It is downward movement, which is very problematic as well. And what that creates is a cycle. Poor people born into poor families who live in poor neighborhoods, thus they go to poor schools. And the result of that is that they get a poor education, usually do not have access to a college education afterwards, and they end up working in low-paying, lower-class types of jobs. Whereas the elite of society are born into well-to-do families, live in well-to-do neighborhoods, attend well-to-do schools, attend well-to-do colleges, and then make their way into well-to-do professions where they continue to live that prosperous upper middle class, upper class type of lifestyle. Next thing I'd like you to write down and think about is down at the bottom of this slide. It asks you which class do you believe you'll identify with as an adult and why. So I'd like you to write out a quick answer to that, give it some thought, have that prepared to turn in also. Now, speaking of social mobility, we were just talking about the lack of social mobility in American society. There are three types of social mobility we look at. One is vertical mobility, one is horizontal, and one is intergenerational. Vertical mobility we'll start with. That's the one that we most commonly talk about. Vertical mobility is when you move up or down between social classes. That means you go from being wealthy to being middle class, or from being poor to being middle class, or from middle class to poor. It is switching vertically, going up or down the social ladder, and increasing either your wealth or your prestige or your power. All right? A second means of looking, or a second way of looking at social mobility is horizontal mobility. That is when you move from job to job without changing social roles. All right? If I spend my life working at Target and I get tired of working at Target, so I go get a job at Shopko, that is horizontal mobility. The pay is similar, the prestige is similar, the benefits are similar, my level of power is similar. So the result of this is that I have switched professions or switched jobs without actually moving up or down the social ladder. The final type of mobility is intergenerational mobility. Intergenerational mobility means basically that you move to a different class from the class you were born into. All right? So you're born into a poor family, and as an adult you strike the lottery, or you hit the lottery, you are going to be moving up in social class. That would be intergenerational mobility. Or you're born wealthy and you spend all your money on ridiculous various items. You blow it all on drugs and bad stock investments, and you end up dirt poor. That is intergenerational mobility as well. Now, the causes of mobility. First of all, looking at upward causes, or causes of upward mobility. Improvements in technology, changes in merchandising patterns, increases in levels of education are all up there. So technology, as we improve our technology, technology can be a very democratic thing. What it provides many people is access to much greater resources than they've ever had before, people of all different social classes. So there is the ability to make more money via technology at this point. Opening up your own shop on something like Etsy, selling off merchandise on eBay. If you are a musician at this point, you can open up your own shop on a site like Bandcamp and sell your music through there. There are various levels of technology that allow us to move potentially upward in society. Changes in merchandising patterns. How does that affect social mobility? We look at, oftentimes, merchandising patterns are going to influence us to buy or not buy certain products. And when we buy certain products, we can move up in social class because of prestige. Part of the wealth concept we talked about was assets. So when we see an increase in certain merchandising patterns, or a change in certain merchandising patterns, it can influence us to buy items that allow us to move up to higher levels of society, at least in terms of the prestige concept. And then we talk about increases in levels of education. And we are a more educated society now than we have ever been at any point in our history. All right? We have people in our society who are achieving high levels of education. A greater number or percentage of people and number of people in American society achieve high school educations at this point. A greater number are going to college. A greater number are graduating from college. Those increases in levels of education also increase upward mobility because it means more and more people are being put out there with the proper skills in order, those proper skills then allow you to reach higher paying jobs and achieve the better compensation that you hope for. Causes of downward mobility, there are constantly shifts in consumer tastes. So when something falls out of fashion, if you are making all of your money in a particular field, and you are selling something that was trendy and has all of a sudden lost its cool factor, that's going to obviously impact you, cause you to fall down in society. As a quick example, at one point in time, your record labels made huge amounts of money by selling vinyl and cassettes and CDs. All right? At this point in time, you have record label after record label failing, and the record industry as a whole struggling because there's been a shift in consumer taste. The consumer doesn't want a CD, a vinyl record, a cassette at this point. Consumers want MP3s. They want the format where you can put it onto a little iPod and walk around with 8,000 songs on one device rather than having that CD that is kind of clumsy, difficult to carry around and everything. That shift in consumer taste has led to a downfall within much of the record industry. It's led to a lot of people losing jobs and a lot of restructuring of business within the record industry. Downward mobility also can be affected by technology, and I would say look at the same thing we just talked about. New technology comes along, the MP3 player comes along, and it makes the CDs and vinyl and cassettes an outdated element of music consumer culture. And finally, just general economic factors. When people, are investing in stocks, stock market's struggling, that is going to cause downward mobility. When unemployment rates surge up over 6, 7, 8%, that's going to obviously cause downward mobility as well. So finally, one more thing I'd like you to consider and write about here. As a graduating high school senior, do you see yourself as having greater upward or downward potential? And I want you to explain to me why you believe that to be the case. Again, write this out, have it prepared for me for tomorrow.